Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, or an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Peinecker, and I am really pleased to have, of course, the co-hostess with the mostest doing a special Mormon Book Reviews appearance. Rebecca Biblioteca is in the house. How are you doing today?
I'm great today, Steve. How are you?
Doing really good. Just finished taping an interview with Kara Burrell from Nuance Ho. And then at the end of the week, I'm taping an interview with Greg from The Quick Show. So I just run the full spectrum here
I
on
was going to say that's
MBR.
kind of
I tell you, I go on an atheist program today with my Jesus t-shirt. Who else is doing that, right? I mean, that's crazy. So either way, it's just kind of fun that we're doing here. And then, it's really fascinating because really when you stop and think about this, Rebecca, this whole thing with you and I started with a very special interview, not knowing where I had like me 250 subscribers. You had a book club that maybe had 2 dozen participants, if that, right at the time. And we were just these two kids not knowing what they're doing. And I'm talking to you on the phone. And I was like, hey, I want you to come on and talk about the book club. And then she said, I'd like to talk about my temple stories. And oh my gosh, I mean, you started telling me the temple stories. Okay, that's the episode. Well, folks, this is the thing. According to what Rebecca told me earlier, that much of the temple stories that she experienced were the Provo Temple. Is that correct?
Yep, all but one. The one where I had my dress on backwards and the zipper was down the front. That was LA. Everything else was in the Provo Temple.
So all your crazy experiences
Yep.
happened in the Provo Temple.
Mhm.
And that was really that was the very first, that was everybody's introduction to Rebecca Biblioteca, was Rebecca and her crazy temple stories. And now we've gone full circle, because what's so fascinating to me is that we have this situation going on that apparently last year was the 50th anniversary of the Provo Temple. And now it's been scheduled for demolition
Mhm.
early next year. And Rebecca had dinner with this gentleman, our new guest, our next guest here, Alan Barnett. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And Alan is actually an archivist for the state of Utah. He got his degree from the University of Utah in historic preservation. And he grew up in the shadow of the Provo, Utah, of the Provo Temple. Okay. So this is an important thing in his life. Now, this is the thing, as we were talking about earlier. This is like a key important temple for a lot of Latter-day Saints. For many of you as BYU students, this is the first time your endowments are taken. If you're a missionary, this is where you had your first temple experience, because the MTC, that's where they would go. And then even on their P days, many of the missionaries would spend their time in the Provo Temple. And so this is like a really important place for a lot of people that have a deep connection to it. And Alan actually and Alan and Rebecca got together, and he was describing to him this thing that he wants to do. He actually wants to save the Provo Temple from demolition. And so we're going to talk about that today, and also talk about how there's actually precedents, that there have been previous attempts to do construction projects in Provo that were announced by the church, and the citizens got together, they did a petition, and they changed the direction of where this project was going to go. So this is, and actually Alan's parents were involved in that when they were trying to build almost a 10-story high skyscraper that would have been at the MTC building. And his parents actually were involved in community activism to prevent that from happening. And so, Alan, there's already a template of having success doing this. This sounds like a long shot. And this is the thing, folks. This is the thing. I know I'm talking long-winded here, but I really think it's really important to establish the background here. As all of you know, I am a good friend of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I come from the evangelical world with a peace offering from the enemy camp, talking to the restoration, talking to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and doing it in a Christian way, in a civil way. So I appreciate the church, and really all in the members of the church, how well they've treated me. I'm friends with a bunch of people in the church office building. So this is not an anti-Mormon thing. This is actually a let's save an important building in Utah that was central to so many people's lives over the course of the last 50 years in Utah. So that's really sets it all up. Rebecca, you actually met Alan. Maybe talk a little bit about what got you two together, and maybe start off the conversation.
Yeah, we ended up having sort of a mutual friend, and we had a wonderful brunch. Actually, my co-host on Mormonish, Landon, was there, and so was my spouse, and just talking about the whole concept of the temple and preserving history, not bulldozing over it. I know people will say it's really funny to hear you saying you want to preserve a temple, but it's a historic destination. It's a historic location, and it has meaning for a lot of people. And I know right now the architecture looks like it's so out of date, right? I don't know if you have a picture of it you can show for your viewers that aren't familiar. My mom told me it's very circular, and it has a tall spire, which is supposed to, I've heard different things, a spire pointing to God, also the pillar of light in the wilderness. My mom told me growing up that it was actually a spaceship. And when the apocalypse comes, it's going to start whirling and take off to Kolob. So that's how I was raised with the temple, that I've talked about my parents before. Anyway, just the idea that you don't necessarily have to completely rip down history and obliterate it. There are ways to preserve it, to respect it, to honor it. There it is. I'm not saying that it's a wonderfully beautiful temple. I'm saying it's a piece of history that all of us, including myself, and Alan will tell you about his experiences there, and meant something to us at the time. There's another temple just like this in Ogden. They have completely demolished that, and it's gone. It now has a very modern looking temple, the birthday cake temple, and you'd never know that this was there. And I've talked to a lot of people who don't understand this is going to be demolished completely. A lot of people think it's going to be renovated, keep some of its original character, but renovated. But no, it's actually going to be demolished. So I think that needs to be talked about before that happens.
And so, Alan, we want to bring you into the conversation because you and Rebecca got together and you want to get the word out that you are doing a petition campaign to save the Provo Temple. And now, of course, folks, too, we know how upset people were when they did the renovations, announced the renovations to the Salt Lake Temple.
Yeah.
I had very faithful Latter-day Saints saying, what is President Nelson doing? Like, they're upset. And so I was like, whoa, and they may not say that to somebody at the war, but they'll say it to me because I'm an outsider. So there were people that were really hurt by this announcement to completely remodel the interior of the Salt Lake Temple. And of course, we have an example of Manti that the citizens stood up and actually prevented this from happening in the Manti Temple. And so there is precedence for this. So we bring Alan into the conversation. Welcome to the show, sir. Tell us about what your project, what you're trying to do here today, sir.
Well, so when they announced, it was in, I think it was in General Conference, October General Conference, 2021. So it's just a few months before the temple's going to be 50 years old. They announced in General Conference that they were going to renovate or rebuild. That it was very vague language, the Provo Temple. And immediately I was alarmed because I'd seen what had happened to the Ogden Temple, and I had always hoped and thought that the church, out of those two temples that were sort of twin sister temples, sort of, I thought they would at least keep one of them. And since they destroyed the Ogden one, I thought, well, then they'll keep the Provo as sort of the representative for that piece of history. So I was alarmed and started talking with friends, and so I put together a petition, and then found out someone else in Provo had also posted a petition. So there were actually two petitions out there. And so we, a group of us, got together and said, what can we do? We knew that, we were aware of that situation at the MTC, where initially the MTC had announced they were going to build this big, tall building right in the middle of these 2- and 3-story MTC buildings. They're going to build a 10-story building, and right adjacent to a residential neighborhood, and the neighbors were unhappy, and they were all faithful LDS people. It was my neighborhood, including my parents, and they had some conversations with the planners of the MTC, and in the end, the people at the MTC of the church went back to the drawing board and came up with a lot better plan than they had initially. It was sort of like they had just come up with this quick oh, well, let's just solve our space needs by putting one big tall building. So they rethought sort of a master plan for the MTC, and the end result was much better. Didn't have such a negative impact on the neighborhood, and I think was better for the MTC too. So we knew about that. We also knew that there had also been an announcement that they were going to take out the murals, the historic murals in the Manti Temple, and that there had been, I'd seen a petition and I'd signed a petition for that, and there was a real outcry, I think, from all over, but I think particularly from people in Manti who just really felt an ownership of that building. And the church had said, okay, well, if people want us to preserve that, we will, and we'll just build a new temple in Ephraim, close, in adjacent city, and that will take care. We can preserve the historic temple, and we still have a modern temple to take care of, whatever the load of patrons to the temple. So we knew there was precedent for that, and we've really felt like if church leaders knew that people were really attached to the Provo Temple. I think there's been an assumption that people don't like the Provo Temple. That it's always been a little bit controversial because it's really the most modern. I mean, in sort of design and style, it is the Provo and Ogden temples, the most modern of all the temples the church has ever built. And for some people, that's a little bit too edgy. And since that time, actually, after that, the temple started moving towards more traditional design, moving back towards more traditional designs. And so you see the newer buildings are much more traditional. So, sort of the point you made, Rebecca, it's well known among preservationists, people who work with historic buildings, that virtually all buildings go through a time period when they seem dated. Mm-hmm. And even the most, what we might consider the greatest historic buildings, the most beautiful buildings ever built, went through a period when people said, wow, that really is outdated. That's really ugly. And what it tends to be in that sort of 40 to 60 year age is sort of where it peaks. And then people start to recognize, there was a time when Gothic buildings were seen as really outdated, Victorian buildings, the stuff that we really love now. And you see that that's clearly the case with the Provo Temple. I talk to younger people. Younger people are much more likely to love the Provo Temple. The younger, the kids who are in college now are much more likely to say, well, oh yeah, I love it. It's a really funky, very cool. They get the vibe of that temple, and people in my generation are much less likely to connect with that because it's that age. And if it could survive that period where people think it feels outdated, then I think it would become universally considered sort of a classic building.
Okay, that's a great way to look at it. And this is, of course, these were temples that were commissioned during the time of President David O. McKay, even though this particular one was built after his death, but it was something that was under his watch. So how were the Ogden and Provo temples received at the time? I'm curious what the reception history is here of these temples.
It's really interesting because I think they were controversial from the very beginning. A lot of people I know, growing up in Provo, I just didn't question it. It's just like, that's what a temple was, and I think there was that way for my parents and for a lot of church members. Just like they were just really pleased to have a temple in their community. There were some people, because really the Provo and Ogden temples were really markedly different than anything that had come before. Like I said, so modern and sort of abstract in their design, but also things like the fact that it had. I know. I mean, there were a lot of jokes about the spaceship temple, which I get. I mean, yeah, it's a space age look. It's sort of that. It's that space age look that you see in the 1960s.
Mhm.
and or you know, the birthday cake, or some people even would talk about the drive up temple, or the drive through temple,
Mhm.
because it was the first, they were the first temples to have like a canopy out front
Mhm.
where you could drive up, and there was this sort of welcoming, you know, so you could drive up and drop someone off at the temple, or you could drive up and pick somebody up, because there was this canopy out front, and it reminded people of a bank.
Mm.
But it's also interesting that, I mean, what it really says in some ways, I think, is that the Provo and Ogden temples were the first temples to sort of acknowledge the automobile age, like include the automobile into their into the equation. And you even see that.
Yeah,
uh,
pull some
I'll
images
share
up.
up I'll share an image here of the architect's rendering of the temple. And um and it's interesting, most times in temple, in the renderings you see of new temples, they will minimize, they would absolutely minimize the parking lot. But here, and also for the rendering for the Ogden temple, cars figure very prominently, and you can see there's that canopy where the cars can drive up through, and then there's plenty of parking. It's this idea of a temple for the modern age. It's not a pioneer temple. It is a temple that works in the modern world. And so yeah, but there were a lot of jokes. And I know I even went through a time when I guess I was in college, maybe high school, college, where I thought this is kind of an odd building. You know, you compare it to Salt Lake Temple or Manti or whatever, and it seemed, boy, this is kind of a far out temple. Seems really weird. But then actually it was in an architectural history class that I had at BYU, and the professor was talking about Egyptian. We were talking about Egyptian architecture. He was talking about Egyptian temples, and he talked about one Egyptian temple where the temple sort of mimics the cliff behind it. And then he just flashed a picture of the Provo Temple with a mountain behind it, and I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." You know, the temple sort of connects with the setting that it's in, and that sort of started this evolution in my thinking, where I started to pay more attention. Well, what is there more to this building than what I had initially thought? And over time, I came to really love and appreciate the beauty. I think the Provo Temple is a fantastic building. I think it's really wonderful. It's really unusual.
Yeah.
But it's really, really interesting, and particularly in the setting that it's in. It has this remarkable setting. The Ogden Temple, I never really, I had driven by the Ogden Temple many times, but I had never walked inside the temple grounds and looked at the temple. When they announced they were going to remodel the Ogden Temple, which is sort of an understatement, I decided, well, I better go see it while I can. So I went up there a couple of different days, walked around, photographed it, so that I would understand it better and how it compared with the Provo Temple. And I was struck with what a beautiful building it is, or it was. And it unfortunately it did not benefit from the dramatic setting the Provo Temple did. It seemed sort of crowded. It didn't have the kind of space to breathe that the Provo Temple does. So it didn't have that great setting, but it was just as beautiful a building. And especially when you look at the details, I thought it was just exquisite, and really this expression of beauty in that time period, you know, in a time period that, like we said, it now seems dated. But when you look at it, say, for the time period, this is just such an elegant, very simple, but very elegant building. So, and so that was a journey that I took to really appreciating the buildings. And actually, from at that point, I started some writing, some things. I wrote a personal essay for a Sunstone. Sunstone sponsored it's an essay, a personal essay contest that they hold in honor of Eugene England, who incidentally was my Sunday school teacher when I was a teenager. And
Really?
yeah.
I love Eugene England.
And so I submitted this essay about my personal journey with coming to appreciate the Ogden and Provo temples, and Sunstone asked if they could publish it. And so after some considerable help with Stephen Carter from Sunstone in editing it, they published it. And then I started doing presentations talking about the history of the Provo and Ogden temples, because I'm like, people need to understand these better, because what I found is a lot of the times the reason people don't appreciate the Ogden and Provo temples is because they didn't understand them. And once I explained it to them, it would change people's mind. They would tell me, they would say, I always thought that was a weird temple, but now I get it. Once they'd had sort of the background and the design explained to them, and said, I really like the Provo Temple. So that was sort of my journey up to the point where there was this announcement that they were going to rebuild the Provo Temple, and so then I started linking up with like-minded people, and we said, what can we do to see if we can get the church to consider, because I personally don't think that the First Presidency really cares. I don't think they have any real reason to want a new temple there. I think the First Presidency, this is just my guess, is that they just want a functioning temple in Provo. I think it's probably the people in the temple design department who don't care for the design, prefer their new modern designs better.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I want to, and that's why I think you make a very compelling case as to why this building needs to be saved, because it reflects a particular time and place, and also it seems to be one of those architectural gems that will probably actually grow in stature if allowed to remain. That will actually be viewed as kind of a really important architectural contribution for its time and place and period, and that it's worthy of historic preservation. And so you make a very compelling argument, because it is kind of a cool. I remember the first time I ever went to Utah, we drove by the Ogden Temple, because my sister took a job at a Pentecostal school in North Ogden. She was dating the pastor's son at the time, but I remember driving by it at the time and seeing it. And it is kind of a stunning, interesting looking structure. And so I also want to tell people that, it's interesting, because I think of when the Prince's book about David O. McKay, probably read it about 15 years ago now, and a couple things stuck out was the Oakland Temple, and then those two temples were kind of important things during his presidency. And so for whatever reason, that kind of stuck in my head as being important things. Rebecca, did you want to chime in?
I was just struck by what Alan said about the temple planning committee or whatever it was. I talked to somebody who worked as an architect there several years ago, and he said, and he experienced this, but the sense was when someone new was put over a project, you'd work on the project, then someone else would come in to oversee it, and they would scrap everything. Like, it was very almost personality driven, that a new person would come in and say, no, we're doing this. He said it was frustrating, because he and his team would work on something for a number of years, and then when something changed as far as the administration or some directive from somewhere, they would scrap everything and start over. So I think there is this strange sense in the church that progress means completely moving forward like that. I mean, we saw that with the Salt Lake Temple. I thought about what Alan said of taking a class at BYU about architecture. I took many of those classes as a humanities major. I took an entire class on the architecture and art of the Salt Lake Temple. I spent 4 months studying that, and it was celebrated back in the day. And now, I mean, I haven't been inside that temple yet, but it seems like it's completely gone. And as I understand it, through a wood chipper, somebody at the church museum told us that they really destroyed everything in there so it wouldn't be used like as a religious relic kind of a situation. But, you know, moving forward like that, like a steamroller, is not necessarily good for anybody. We need to celebrate and honor our roots. We need to understand where we came from, and especially when it comes to art. I was a humanities art history major with an emphasis in architecture. It's extraordinarily important. And Alan is absolutely right. There's that period. I read some article about it. I think it was someone in the church that said, oh, you know, the Model T, it was a great car, you know, when it was made, but now it's so outdated, right? But now look at it, right? Now the Model T, I wish we all had one, right? We'd have a lot of money. So yeah, you just have to help people understand and appreciate beyond just, well, that's a weird looking thing. The other thing I know about the Provo Temple is that it is very functional, you know, exactly goes along with that streamlined look. It's very well organized in the inside. It's very able to move, you know, large groups of people through it. I mean, I think some of these other temples could take a lesson from that. You know, there's a lot of wasted space I've seen in a lot of the temples that I've toured. So this temple has a lot going for it, a lot to learn from it, and its place in history. And I think you need to look at that before you just completely demolish it. And I still don't think a lot of people understand, as Alan said at conference, oh, we're remodeling or rebuilding. Demolish to the ground, and then something else, probably exactly what's in Ogden, I'm guessing. I mean, we have now the pop-up temple, right? There are prefabricated pieces just waiting, you know, to just be stood up, pop up, and then, or I guess it's a tip-up temple, not a pop-up temple. One of those words, you know, and just kind of put together. It's not the same. So I don't know. I'm on a soapbox. I have a button on.
Well, yeah, I'm with you on that, and the fact that it's so unique, and a lot of it, and I guess part of what I try to explain to people when they don't understand the Provo Temple, it's really built in response to, at the time, there hadn't been any new temple. I mean, this is like 1967 when they first announced the Provo and Ogden temples. There hadn't been a temple dedicated in Utah since the Salt Lake Temple in 1893. So it had been decades and decades, which is hard to imagine now.
It's very hard to imagine.
But the Logan and the Salt Lake temples have become so clogged. They had so many people coming. They would wait an hour or two before they could even get into a session. And so there was this idea, we need to make this process more efficient. And so by that time, they had started making films, and they used in place of a live endowment where it's presented by, you know, temple workers, actors, and they had done a film and used it in the Oakland Temple. And so but then the architect is given the job of, okay, build a temple where we can move the work forward, where people can come in and efficiently get through the sessions. There's not a lot of waiting. And he uses that, and he comes up with this ingenious plan of having like 6 endowment rooms, and you can just, and it's scheduled so every 20 minutes there's a new session starting. So when, you know, back in the day when I was at BYU and I would go to the temple fairly regularly, I never checked, well, when does the session start? When do I need to get there? I just went there, and I knew that within 20 minutes there would be a new session starting, and that's just the way it worked. And so, but then the architect just has this sort of, the story is interesting, and I think it may be told in Prince's book on David O. McKay about sort of how this plan comes to him, almost, you know, like almost as inspiration, where he can just envision suddenly how the pieces all fit together. And then the thing that makes the temple so unique is that he lays out the inner, how it needs to function, how the spaces need to be laid out to make it work smoothly. And then he builds the outside around it. Whereas in most cases, most typically in other temples and a lot of architecture, the architect will come up with how they want the building to look on the outside, and then they'll try to fit the spaces inside. And that's what makes the Provo Temple, Ogden Temple so unique, is that he creates how it needs to function inside, and then he puts an exterior around those spaces that he needs on the inside, which is a very modernist idea that form follows function, that you figure out how the building's supposed to function, and then that gives you the form of the building. And that's why you get these really unique buildings. And then after that, even though they changed the form, the Washington D.C. temple is essentially the same floor plan as Provo and Ogden. It's just put in this sort of or hexagonal, kind of elongated hexagon shape, but it's essentially the same plan because it worked so smoothly. And many temples after that, Mexico City, and they become these landmark buildings that sort of become patterns for temples for years to come.
Okay, so I want you to pull up your change.org petition, and you pull yours up, and then maybe pull up I guess a second person, so maybe people can sign up on both petitions. And what you want to do is just get the word out there. This is what you, as a person who's watching this program, can participate in to express your support for not demolishing the Provo Temple, but to really try to preserve it. And because of this is an important historic landmark that is kind of a revolutionary architectural design. And so you're almost at your goal of 2,500, and you want to get, and of course, then probably get more than that after that. And so, tell us a little bit about this.
There are two petitions. They're essentially, I mean, the same sentiment. The wording is a little bit different. There's this one, preserve the Provo Temple, and then the other one is preserve the Provo, Utah Temple. And it's just that we set them up. We didn't know the other person was doing one. So, but the one, it was Jen Bruton, who is very attached, was married in the temple, grew up near the temple, married in the temple, and has such a deep connection to it, and has passed that connection on to her children. And so she set up the other one. But I think signing either of them would be great. If there's one that you prefer, at some point we will submit these to the church. We'll submit both of them, I think. And so do
you prefer people just to sign one rather than both at this point?
I think signing one is fine because we're coordinating between the two of us.
Okay.
So
okay, so this is preserve the Provo Temple. And why don't you scroll to the top real quick, just so people can see the change. Okay, so you're going to go to change.org, and then and then if you just type in preserve the Provo Temple on change.org, if you Google that, will that come up then?
Yes, it will.
Okay, so Google that. We'll also have links in the description to this as well. And then of course, so we even on this petition, you even got an article by you talking about why this is important. And so get the word out there. And so again, go check out change.org, check and go to the preserve the Provo Temple. And I want you to exit out again real quick, Alan. So this is what I want to do is I want to wrap it up with this. And this is the thing. This is, you have the personal aspect of this too. What did this temple mean to you personally? Or maybe you have a story of somebody that it was personal to them. Maybe we'll start off with you, Rebecca.
Well, first I would say that if every person who got engaged in front of that temple would just sign it, you would have 100,000 or more signatures. Everybody went. I can't tell you how many of my roommates. I didn't get married till I was 26. So I had many roommates return home at night and say, oh my gosh, and it always happened up at the temple, right? Also, sometimes on dates, people would try to drive you up there and you knew then what was going to happen. You could say yes or no, right? It was a spot. It was a dating spot. It was an engagement spot. And again, I've talked before on your show, Steve, about my, just nervousness about going to the temple, my trepidation. My parents had really weird ways that they talked to me about it, and so I did not have great experiences going in. I had kind of crazy experiences like I've shared, but it was where I took my endowments out. It was where I went 2 weeks before. Then I went to LA and got married. It was, where I met my then fiance's prior fiance. That was interesting. Happened to me the first day I went through. So that's another story for another day. But again, I'm just saying it doesn't matter if you're a post-Mormon or a nuanced Mormon now. And maybe the temple means something different to you. You still have to look at it as it was a part of your life. It was a place where something happened. And for me, I equate it more with my college experience. I drove past it all the time. It was just there. It was in the background, like Alan explained. So if somebody were to say to me, well, you're more of a post-Mormon? How can you want to wear a button about the temple? It was part of those pivotal years. It was there at BYU. It was something everybody was doing. It was part of every ward, and it was just there. And it deserves to have its place in history, to remain. I think they probably could remodel it and it would just be fine. I mean, as far as, make a few little additions or changes, whatever they need, or like in Manti, maybe build something next to it. But I think that legacy needs to be preserved of that era, because like you said, there were hardly any temples being built then. It's not like now. This was brand new. Even in Washington State, where I grew up, I remember looking at the church news and looking at this really interesting looking building. I would have only been 8 or 7, and having my mom explain to me, this is a new temple. It's a spaceship. I mean, like I said, my parents, but still pivotal, right? So sign the petition. Let's see what happens. I think we can make a difference.
And Alan, maybe just talk about what this means to you on a personal level, what that temple has meant to you in your life, that you grew up in the shadow of this temple as part of your life, and just talk about that.
It's, for me, I guess I took it for granted for so long. It wasn't, in some ways, until I realized that it could be lost, that I realized how important that the temple was to me. It is the place. The first time almost all of my temple experiences have been in the Provo Temple. I've been to a few other temples, the Salt Lake Temple, Jordan River Temple, other temples here and there, but that's the temple where I received my endowments. It's where I went and did baptisms for the dead, and I went to that temple many, many times. But even more than that, it was there in the background growing up because it was so close by. Before, I grew up just west of the MTC, sort of that neighborhood, MTC, BYU Stadium area. And before the MTC was built, there was just a few years in there, 3 or 4 years, but before they built the MTC, after the temple was built. But at night, you would drive up our street, and there was a temple floating up above. It was all lit up. It was just there all the time. And I know sometimes at night, me and my friends, we'd go up by the temple, and I just remember, like, Provo was a smaller town and it was a little bit quieter. And it would be so quiet. You'd hear the crickets, and there the temple would just be this sort of glowing presence. And for me, well, and another thing, I had a discussion with my brother about this, because he feels really deeply. He feels so hurt about what the church wants to do with this temple. It feels like it is sort of the marker of home for me. And I think, I guess that's one of the things that bothers me about this whole thing, is that this building was built, dedicated in 1972. Since that time, all of us in Provo were told, this is the house of the Lord. This is a sacred place. This is a place that you should be attached to, that should be important to you. And it became important to us. It became important to tens of thousands of people, and in different ways. And the way that I feel about it now is different than I did when I was a kid or when I was in college. There's something about the temple and a sort of abstract kind of design, sitting there in that setting with the mountains in the background. It almost, to me, feels like a mediator between God's creation, represented by the majestic mountains, and humanity living around it. There's something just so striking to me about its setting and its abstract. It doesn't just like a human building. It's something a little bit otherworldly, and it feels like, to me, a mediator. And so there are very few places in this world that feel sacred to me. And the Provo Temple is maybe at the top of that list for me. It feels like a sacred place that helps me feel centered. And I think that's what a temple is supposed to be. And yet the fact that it can be regarded as disposable, I think it's just, the Nauvoo Temple was destroyed by enemies of the church. There was a temple in Samoa that burned down and had to be rebuilt. But Provo and Ogden is the first time the church has ever deliberately demolished a temple. And I'm like, how do you demolish the house of the Lord? How do you demolish a place? How do you tell me that this is so sacred, that I should be so attached to this place, that this place should have such meaning to me? And yet you can just decide that, well, it's kind of dated. We don't really like the look of it. So we're just going to toss it out and build a new one. I'm like, what does that mean for sacred space for those of us in the LDS community? What does that say? What is really sacred if anything can be tossed out on a whim, even after it's been sort of ingrained to us how important it is? So, and I just talked to so many people about this, and there are some people like, oh, that's fine. It'll be nice to have a new temple. And then I get other people who they just tell me they're heartbroken. They just say, I'm just heartbroken. I just can't stand to see it go because it's become so much a part of my life and of where I live. And so it feels very personal to me. I feel it feels really personal for a lot of people. I feel like it's really an example. There's so many things I could say about it, but one of the things that I think is interesting, if you look at the petition, is it's about a 2-to-1 women to men. And I think how many women were involved in this decision to tear down the temple? And what if some women had been involved? Would the decision have been different? I just feel like somehow it is that sort of the nature of the sort of corporate bureaucracy of the church, where somebody in Salt Lake, like you said, Rebecca, in the temple design department, they get someone in new who just has this idea, and they're going to push it forward. And then it's done without regard to the people who actually attend the temple, who donated. This is one of those old temples where people donated to the temple. It wasn't just built. The church just didn't come in and build it. Everybody in the stakes in the temple district were asked to contribute to the temple. My parents donated to the temple. So it's the sacrifice of the saints that built this temple. And yet it becomes just the property of the corporation, and they do whatever they want. It's just sort of that it's become the nature of the corporate bureaucracy of the church. And I see this as a perfect example where the people who are most affected by this decision are not the ones who are being asked about the decision. So, and that's where I've been trying to encourage people. It's like, this is not to rebel against church leaders or to defy the prophet. This is just to say, this is important to us, and we want you to know it's important to us. And we feel like if you know how important it is to us, there's no reason that this couldn't be done differently, and they couldn't be preserved with all that meaning intact. So,
well said, Alan.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that I was able to provide this platform for you to
I really appreciate
talk
it
about this. And I want you folks to, leave your comments. What do you think? Does the church have a fiduciary responsibility to the people who contribute to build those temples in the first place? As caretakers of these things, this is really important conversations that we all need to have. And of course, I'm an outsider. These are conversations that need to be had within the Latter-day Saint at the tables over dinner in Provo and in Utah and in the Mormon corridor and throughout the world. What is the purpose of a temple, right? Is it a sacred place? And if it's a sacred space, is it something that should be preserved? It's a great question. I think we need to ponderize that, if you will, and talk about that, because those are things that you need to think about. What is a sacred space? And as a believer, if you believe it's a sacred space, should it be preserved? And that's a great question to ponder as well and think about. Alan, I want to thank you so much for coming on the program today.
Can I make just one more comment?
Certainly.
So part of what we did, this group, because it was the 50th anniversary of the temple, we said we have to do something. The temple didn't really do. They could. Well, they had most temples have an option to mark anniversaries. From what I understand, the Provo Temple presidency was asked specifically not to mark the anniversary of this one. So we felt like somebody needs to do something to say this is a big anniversary. So we put together a program, and I did which includes a presentation where I do this sort of explanation of the history. And I think if people are interested, it's a good way to understand. You will come away with a different understanding once
Do you have a link to this on YouTube? Your presentation?
Yes, it's on YouTube.
Okay, Alan will make sure that you send us a link so we can link to that talk on YouTube in the description, folks. And as Alan looks like you're looking for it, so maybe while you're doing that, Rebecca, was there anything you wanted to add to this while we're wrapping this up?
No, I appreciate getting to know Alan and getting to know more about the Provo Temple. You know, like I said, it was a backdrop to my entire college experience and also working at BYU. It was just kind of always there, and it's quirky, but I do think it's a beautiful temple.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I love it. I love that we're having this I'm actually honored and privileged that we're having this conversation here on this channel. That it's become a place where people can come and hear their voice, have their voice be heard. And I'm glad that Alan reached out, and I'm glad we had this conversation today. And Alan, are you finding what you're looking for? And your microphone is off, so there we go. Okay, so here we are.
Okay.
There we go. So
Okay.
this was the program that we put together on the anniversary day of, it was February 9th, 2022, which was 50 years to the day of the dedication of the program. And I give a presentation where I give that background history and help people understand why the temple looks the way it does, how it was designed. And then we did some interviews with a few people who, people that I knew from my neighborhood, and they talk about their experiences with the temple. So if people are interested in understanding the temple better, here it is on.
Okay, so there it is, and the channel name is Provo Temple 50 Years. We'll put a link in the description to this video so you can watch it as well to learn, get some knowledge here, learn about the history. This is really interesting that you're doing this, and I want to thank you for just taking the time to be an activist. This is something that's you're really passionate about. And why don't you exit out of screen share, and we'll wrap this up. So folks, I just want to get your comments. What do you think about this? I'd love to hear what you think about all of this as well. I want to also hear from outsiders. What do you think about this? Is just as from a secular standpoint, is not an architectural structure that is worthy of preservation for its own sake, for the architectural contributions that it makes at a particular time and place. These are all things that we all need to have these conversations about. So really appreciate both of you coming on this program. I do want to remind you that we do have a website that has a merch store, MormonBookReviews.com, where we have lovely merch. We have hot chocolate mugs, we have hats, and we have seat covers, and we have mouse pads and what have you. MormonBookReviews.com. Also, for those of you who like to financially support us, we have links on Patreon, PayPal, as well as Venmo. Thanks again, everybody. I really do appreciate everybody who is supporting the channel financially. Couldn't do it without you. It enables me to travel, enables me to do upgrade of equipment. $20, $100, $1,000 goes a long way on this channel. So anybody who wants to contribute, I really do greatly appreciate it. And just remember this, folks. Remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.